but I can order more. So if you haven't received a book and would like a book, let me know. Email me and I'll place an order. I'll probably order another 25. It's a bulk discount copy. And so we'll probably be selling those with probably copiers here on April 10th at 7 p.m. in this room. So mark your calendars. You won't hear me okay? Fuzzy? Is that better? How about now? I didn't change it. We are, it's the same. Yeah, we All right, many of you have handouts that say Section 1. That's fine because we didn't get through the material last week. And though by temperament I am a completionist and absolutely have to get through everything on time, I'm giving myself a little grace. Because our goal here, as I mentioned last week, is to be students of this word of Jesus's on the mountaintop in the Gospel of Matthew. So the more time we can spend with this through the lens of people like Father John Deere, I think the more it will benefit us. So I'm putting no pressure on myself to get anywhere in particular. If we can get through this today and start getting into Mark, we'll talk about Mark and Empire. Otherwise, we'll punt to next week. There's always more to do, and I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, I hope. So there's always more to do. Any insights or recaps for those who weren't here from last week? What were your takeaways? Anyone want to share anything from our discussion last week? Carolyn.
The distinction between nonviolent and violent. It's not passivity.
Yes.
One definition is not passivity.
Great. So if we take away nothing other than this helpful frame for understanding what nonviolence is and is not, it's this. Nonviolence, in the writings of people like Martin Luther King and Father John Deere, is a third way. It is a third way in between extremes. As Aristotle famously taught, virtue is in the mean between two different extremes. The extremes we're talking about here are indifference, passivity, indolence, or non-violence, which I think is kind of helpful in some ways. In other ways, it's confusing because not everyone follows that rule. But that means opting out. It means seeing the violence in the world and not liking it, but not being willing to take a stand. The other extreme is what we could call violence, right? Using force, manipulation, coercion to enforce my will, the will of us, whoever us may be, on the will of the other in order to get what we want, without their full cooperation and participation. And often, when we think about this, we do think about it in a polarized way. That is, there's violence and there's nonviolence. And when we set it up that way, then nonviolence looks really problematic, right? Because the only option is to be a doormat. So the purpose in looking at the third way of nonviolent Christ-like love is to say, in any situation, hopefully the best action, if it's available to us, will be something in between or something other than not doing anything and using violence to achieve our goals. The difficulty is, those two extremes are kind of baked into us. Whether it's by nature or the way that we're socialized, we all have a fight or flight mentality. And one or the other option may present itself naturally to us according to our temperament. There are those for whom aggression comes naturally. If you take my parking space, I'm getting out of the car and I'm gonna go at you. Or maybe if I'm, more of a passive person, I'm just gonna stalk you in the grocery store and think about all the things that I'm gonna do to you. But I'm not gonna do anything. This third way doesn't really seem to occur naturally. That is, it's something we have to learn. It's something we have to practice over time. It's something we have to be initiated into, this way of nonviolence. And the work of the civil rights activists with people like James Lawson saw that you really do have to train for these kinds of things. You can't just walk into a situation of civil disobedience and think, if I think hard enough, I'll be able to resist these beatings without getting angry, which is why Lawson practiced, receiving beatings, and had the people who were learning from him, they practiced undergoing these things so that when they get into the situation, they're going to be able to handle themselves. It's not too different from military training in that way, only this is nonviolent training. So in each of these situations that may come up, whether it's in a personal situation, an interpersonal situation, something like activism or something like work, the goal is to find this third way, which requires us to be attentive. It requires us to be awake in every moment to see where our creativity, where our imagination can take us. And we talked a little bit about this last week when we saw that if we're following a third way approach, there aren't really rules. There's not a given rule that this is how you should act in a given situation. There may be some parameters. There are great examples, but it's up to our discernment in each situation what and whether we are able to act. And so, as with all things, this is about practice. It's about failing and learning from our failures and trying it again. We won't always get it right, but the purpose, isn't to get it right all the time. And the purpose of nonviolent Christ-like love is not to end violence. We can't do that. It would take violence to sort of put a stop to violence in that way. It's to introduce friction. Right? It's to introduce friction in the cycle of violence, where we see that either a violent response to violence always increases the violence in the system. It doesn't ever decrease it. We can never see an instance where going to war ends violence. It moves it around a little bit. And the same is true for passivity. If you let the violent be violent, that also doesn't introduce any friction. We don't see instances where letting the people take over, letting the conquerors come, decreases the amount of violence. Again, it just moves it. So we're looking for a way to introduce friction in the system. And the way that we see in the Gospels, or at least in this reading of the Gospels, is that that's love. Love is a way of absorbing some of the energy, some of the power of violence, so that it can introduce some friction to the system and create some flexibility in people's responses. And sometimes that's the best we can do, is introduce some flexibility, introduce some new options so that it doesn't just run the normal violent course. And so we started last week with the end of this particular section on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus kind of throws down the gauntlet, as it were, and shows what's at stake in this. He says a verse that none of us like to think about too much: be perfect, right? You don't say that to a room of Catholics, because we all just sort of, I'm trying, I'm not good enough. He says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Be whole, be complete. We might even translate this loosely as grow up. Grow into what you were made to be. And as we all know, growth takes time. But linked to this idea of you have to be perfect, what does that mean for Jesus? It means not resisting, not violently resisting the evildoer. And he gives this example of how the sun shines on the good and the bad alike. The rain comes down on the good and the bad alike. That's God. God is like this sun and this rain that's constantly just being God's infinite and compassionate love at everything, sort of indiscriminately. And Jesus seems to put his faith in this approach. And so he says to his followers, we're going to become God. And here's how you do this. You're going to learn to shine on everybody. You're going to learn how to reign on everybody. But this does take intelligence. It takes creativity. He wouldn't have spent, several verses worth of here are some different situations if this were just an easy thing. If it just meant when someone hits you, don't do anything. That's not what he says, though we can interpret it that way if we want. So Jesus thinks when God has kids, children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will call you children of God. When God has kids and they grow up, they tend to look like these people, right? They're active. Now, we may not all be famous, but we can all be active in our own spheres, in our own life. There's that verse. And then we talked a little bit about this. We went back to the beginning of this section of Jesus's antitheses. You've heard it said, but I say to you. And we talked a little bit about what it means to be reconciled. and sort of what's at stake for Jesus in both our relationships with one another and how that relates to this thing that we call worship. Jesus doesn't seem to think that we can worship God and harbor grudges against people. Jesus seems to think that somehow the worship of God, even the liturgical worship of God, he's using temple language, even the liturgical worship of God involves our relationships with other people, such that if those relationships aren't intact, neither will our worship be sort of helpful or fitting. We talked a lot about that last week, and that's kind of where we left things. So further comments, and then we're going to jump into the rest of these verses and see how far we can get in a combination of both small group discussion and bringing it all back together. Any comments or questions before we move on? Yeah.
What is Raka?
Raka, it's just a mean thing. You know, jerk, fool. It's a term that would be used with derision. So a very rude term. We could think of examples of that I won't say because this is being recorded. Yeah, Mary Jo.
When you were describing that it takes, the third way takes creativity and practice, and I'm thinking that it's also a mindset shift. That it's not just creativity in the moment, but it's a real shift in how one looks at things, that third way, right? And that's what comes to mind.
I think you're right, Mary Jo. I think the word I would tend to use is something like conversion. Or Jesus' own word, metanoia. We're going to hear it when Lent starts in just a week or two. Is it next week? Wow. Change your life. Meta meaning to change. Nous meaning sort of the central way that we interact with reality, our reality interface, if you will. We need to change our operating systems. We need to change the way both that we see the world and that we react to the world. The word repent doesn't really begin to get at what this transformation is. And part of that, I'm convinced, also means revisiting what we think we are. If I think that I am an enclosed self that sort of can live without other people, and if left alone, I'd be fine, and maybe some other friends. If I think that I am sort of contained within this body and am a monad, so to speak, then it's going to be really hard for me to practice nonviolence because I'm always worried about protecting me. But if we begin to see one another if I begin to see you as what I am, if we take Paul seriously when he says, you all are the body of Christ. There is one body, one head, who's Jesus. If we had a more corporate sense of our identities, it becomes easier to practice nonviolence with such a vision because any violence is violence against me. Yeah?
Just in practicality, working with special needs kids are very much fight, flight, or freeze. We teach regulate and connect. So if you can pause, that's helped me so much.
Yes.
Because of ADHD and impulsivity, it's like breathe, pause, regulate, and then you can start connecting with people. We found that very helpful.
Yeah, and this is sort of a basic foundation of mindfulness that I think even Jesus talks about paying attention. He says, stay awake, which my interpretation of that means be attentive to what's happening. Not only special needs kids, but special needs adults in a relationship often need to pause, right? We need to say, hey, I need a timeout. I'm not able to regulate right now. Can I come back? And this can be very threatening sometimes to other people, to spouses. If we say, hey, I need to take a timeout. Well, are you leaving? Just for a minute, and then I'm going to come back. We're actually not very good at this as a society. We're really not good at self-regulation. And I think we see more and more evidence of this mounting every day. And that's sort of it's a basic need. We're not even at the level of sort of nonviolent creative love here. We're just trying to take care of ourselves, but that's a fundamental need if we're going to be able to do things like think creatively in any situation. We can't do that if we are panicking. And so we have to learn how not to panic. Which is maybe why, anytime an angel shows up in Scripture, the first words are? stop screaming. Don't panic, right? He even says it to Mary, stop screaming. We're here to talk. Anything else before we move on to this next passage? Okay. You've heard that it, You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body cast into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body go into Gehenna.
Pretty violent.
It is a bit violent, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So at the surface level, what are your impressions? First, this is kind of violent. Jesus is talking about maiming yourself. So how do we see this as an instance of this third way? If Jesus is committed to this third way, we don't see Jesus actually cutting people's hands off or plucking out eyes. What is he trying to get at here? And even before that, the surface reading, what else do you notice about this text?
When I read that, I thought about Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
And I don't think he got enough recognition for nonviolence that he strived for during his presidency.
Okay.
I read that during his presidency, we were not at war with another country, and that's unique. And I think it was a very intentional thing for him. When I read this, it looks very violent, and it looks almost like an exaggeration. I mean, it is an exaggeration. Do not cut your arm off if no. But there's something to that, and I think that Jimmy Carter might have read that and really picked up on what the intention was.
Yeah. Others.
You know, there's a lady who said I was supposed to be blind, put out her eyes, and I think, if you do that, you consider psychotic, But that's going pretty far, too.
Yeah.
Sin.
Yeah. Who is this for? Just the bare meaning of the passage.
The Jewish people?
He's definitely talking to Jews, but even more specifically, look at the pronouns. Men, right? This is, we could play with it a little bit, and maybe we should, but at first glance, he's talking to men about women, right? We have to play with it in order to sort of figure out what he would say to women about this and whether he would. So at first glance, he's talking to men and about how men should deal with their needs, their wants, their imaginations. So why use the violent language? Why use the hyperbole? And what am I supposed to do with it, if not cut off my hand or my eye? What's at stake here? Let's listen to what Father John Deere has to say about the passage. Maybe this will help. This is a challenging passage. And if you want to read along, this is page 26. For Jesus, this is all urgent life or death stuff. He wants us to make our inner transformation, and here we're back to Mary Jo's comment that this requires something like a conversion. He wants us to make our inner transformation towards purity and nonviolence a priority, so that we do whatever we need to rid ourselves of violence, anger, hatred, resentment, lust, fear, and selfishness. To push us into the immediate work of reforming and disarming ourselves, Matthew's Jesus uses violent imagery to wake us up to the urgency of pure nonviolence toward all others, saying, protect your heart at all costs, even if it means suffering the loss of an eye or a hand. What is the problem with lust here in this context? Anyone have any guesses? What does lust cause?
Distraction.
Causes distraction, that's for sure. Daryl?
It can objectify the person that you're in a relationship with.
Yes.
Not seeing them as a person.
Precisely. So think about the eye and the hand. Lust causes us to see a certain way, and then what do we do when we see that thing in a certain way? We reach out to take it and to get anything that's in the way, sort of out of the way. So it would seem that Jesus is seeing lust as a way of seeing the world as a set of objects to be craved and to be taken. Maybe not through brute force immediately, through strategy or through laying traps but it's distracting because lust captures the object and sort of enslaves me to that object so that I can have it and I can take it. And, here in this context, he's talking about sex, but we can lust after all kinds of things. We can see the one thing that will make us happy that we must get at all costs, and we do everything to get that. Even things like peace, and we will do whatever it takes to get peace, even if it means bombing your children. We will get there. And we see examples of this, at the macroscopic level all the way down to how we act. And Jesus seems to be saying, if our vision is broken like that, so that we're just looking at the world with this acquisitiveness, it's better to be blind. It's better to not see these things than to see them through the lens of, I have to have it, right? And if that doesn't work, then it's better to cut ourselves off from the opportunity to get these things than it is to suffer them. And so that might just mean, again, this idea of a timeout. Sometimes I can't help but be triggered. So before I better remove myself from the situation. Eventually, I hope I could be around 4 screaming children and just be like Zen, but maybe I can't, so I need to go to the bathroom for like 15 minutes and, read Facebook or whatever it is. So sometimes we have to remove ourselves from the situation. We have to do violence, so to speak, so that we don't do violence to others. But it's clear from the context that Jesus does not think that we ought to be actually sort of physically hurting ourselves. This passage is helpful, says John Deere, if we open ourselves to its wisdom and compassion. It expresses Jesus' urgent desire that we change whatever we have to change about ourselves so that we become like him, people of compassion and peace. Anyone have any success with this? Seriously, has anyone experienced even the smallest inner transformation in how you see the world and becoming a little bit more open, a little bit less violent? Victor, you want to say a little bit?
I've been in a 12-step program for many years, and one of the things is pause and agitate. And I've learned 50% of the time maybe I'm doing it, trying to get higher, but it is to step back a little bit and respond instead of reacting to the situation. Sometimes I can stop and say, is this really important enough to get upset about? And kind of remove that from my thing. One of the things is that kind of also ask God's help to remove these defects of character. So I'm incredibly immature emotionally, as many classes in business taught me, but it has been a slow change, but it is something to work towards.
Yeah, I think people in recovery are in recovery because they see clearly the stakes of what happens if they don't change. Many of us don't see that very quickly, right away. And that kind of motivation, if you're unfortunate and fortunate enough to sort of receive it, can be a very strong motivation to make those little changes. Yeah, Mary Jo.
I changed my management style after learning about nonviolence. I was a driver, I made things happen, I got great energy out of doing everything that I was doing, and never thought that that management style actually was creating anger, frustration, and actually I had to look at myself and say, is this really who I want to be? Of course, your culture, I got all kinds of recognitions and bonuses and all of that good stuff, but it really wasn't who I wanted to be.
Yeah. What happened when you changed? What happened?
Well, I'm still changing. My husband still thinks I'm a workaholic, but I think I'm a more compassionate one.
Yeah.
But it is, it's a work in progress, and it's been a long time.
Yeah, and often, there are those of us who show more aggression towards ourselves and more impatient towards ourselves than we will display towards other people. But we are among those to whom we're supposed to demonstrate this love. So sometimes that can be very difficult as well, to put up with myself while I'm on the slow route to change, where I wish God would just do this. But that would be a bit violent, wouldn't it? To just change me against my will. That would be somewhat violent. Daryl, yeah. And then Rose.
Off of what Mary Jo just said, my job involves a lot of sales and we're given numbers that we have to meet every week. And I've been struggling a lot lately with, as I'm approaching customers, not objectifying them, not seeing them as a sale to be made, actually a person that needs help that I'm supposed to provide a service for, and to be more attentive to what they need in that moment, regardless if it results in me getting a sale or not. And knowing that there may be consequences if I don't make those numbers. But I honestly think the more that I am just focused on being intentional and connecting with the person, I think it'll just work itself out. But I'm trying to, I feel where you're coming from in my point.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us feel that way in our jobs and being productive and producing, and how much that ties into how we relate to other people.
Yeah, and this relates to a different facet of this that theologian that I mentioned last week, Walter Wink, thinks a lot about, and I'll just touch on it. But there's a sense in which we can be enmeshed in systems and expectations that are pretty consistent within themselves that make it easier or less easier to act in certain ways. So if you are in sales, there's a certain atmosphere that everyone sort of co-creates that drives you to treat other people like sources of revenue, and really makes it hard to treat other people as anything but that, even during Christmas season, especially during Christmas season. And we can all think in our own ways in which this sort of ambient atmosphere that we all create around ourselves that is held in place by people in power, but we all have to collaborate to create that sense, how that does make it more difficult to be creative, to be imaginative, to try the new thing. Someone like Walter Wink would say, that might be a good instance of the demonic, where we're looking at something that is bigger than ourselves, that is sort of independent of what I can do, but that I'm sort of bound up in, that prevents me from being free. And it's not necessarily the most evil thing in the world, to work for Starbucks or whatever. So we're not talking like big scary demons, but maybe just like little imps of like, we've co-created this system that makes it hard to be good, right? And we're all stuck in it and we can't get out, and no one person can fix it. Well, what do we need? We need an exorcist. So it's no accident that, especially in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' primary function is to heal people, but especially to exorcise them from the sort of enmeshment in these principalities and powers, to use Paul's language. That's a different conversation, but I think what it helps us to see is, A, we're all in this together, because we're all creating these situations together, and B, to kind of go back to Victor's point, this is bigger than any of us. We really do need some kind of help to sort of get out of these systems, even if it's as everyday as when I go to work, I'm expected to treat people in such a way, and I can't find a way to square that with how I know I should be treating people. Over time, that can wear us down. Over time, it really can. Rose, your thoughts?
This is a more literal example.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, I used to run cross country, and I had a classmate, Dora, that was the teammate. And we were out in the field one day for practice, and I was kind of absent-minded, they're like ants, and I was just kind of absent-mindedly just kind of killing them while we were just waiting around. And it's so weird how like somebody says something to you and it like totally shifts your mindset. But she just said to me like, "What did that ant do to you?" And I don't know why, all of a sudden I just was like, "Yeah, why am I doing this?" And so now like I don't kill bugs because it's just sort of like changed, like you suddenly look at the world so differently just because somebody said like, it's just one phrase to you.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about like, yeah, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And so, but it's been interesting over the years. It drives my family crazy, but like there's a spider in the house, I'll literally get a jar and like, capture it, take it outside. Outside of mosquitoes and cockroaches.
Yeah.
But it's always interesting to see people's reaction when I do that, because they're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "There's no point. Why am I killing this? Like, it has as much a right to exist as I do." And then just to see people's faces, like, I don't think anyone's now not killing bugs because of what I'm saying, but it's just interesting to see people's reaction and to like give them that pause of like, "Oh, yeah."
Yeah, and that's a way of introducing friction, right? It's something as small as I'm irritated, and so I'm going to destroy this living creature. That I'm not hurting anything in a cosmic sense, and yet within myself, what would it look like if I didn't do that? What would happen if I put the brakes on it? That's a small way of practicing, and that's why things like vegetarianism or veganism, for people who practice them, most people who do this on purpose don't think they're making a difference. In terms of reducing the destruction of animals or anything like that. It's a spiritual perspective, or it's a way of renewing a spiritual perspective that says every time I see, a creature, a living thing, I see it first as a co-creation with me, a brother or sister, so to speak, that, Brother St. Francis would say, brother, sun, sister, moon, they're all sort of co-creations with us. And first I'm always going to see the dignity there. And then if I need to smash him, I will, but at least I've had a moment of recognition, or even the way that many indigenous peoples who do eat meat will at least give thanks. And in fact, even in this ritual world, the eating of meat was always connected to the idea of sacrifice. You would sacrifice this thing and then take some of it back, but it was recognizing that it's all part of the whole. And we've lost a lot of that. And I see people individually and even as groups trying to find different ways of tapping back into that holistic vision, whether it's becoming a vegan, so that I'm always sort of constantly in the face of how much death there is, which is kind of depressing, but it also allows me to respond, or in other smaller ways, like not killing bugs and letting the spiders do it instead. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. We'll have an occasion to talk a little bit more about these themes. It was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a bill of divorce. But I say to you, says Jesus, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, most of us, I think, are Catholics, so we have a history with the interpretation of this verse and what it has meant for us. So the challenge here in this context is, again, to ask, how is this a third way? What are the two extremes that are being avoided in this context? So I want you to take a few minutes at your tables and wrestle with that question. Try to be creative. How could this possibly be a creative response to a problem that avoids sort of resignation, apathy, indolence, a refusal to do anything on the one hand, and outright violence on the other? See what you come up with. Just take maybe 4 or 5 minutes, okay? For all that talking, someone better have an insight. More questions than answers, okay? What were some of your questions?
Why is the fact that just because they get the divorce, a woman committed adultery, why does one action impact the other?
Right. Yeah. How does the man's decision in this case force a woman to do this, what appears to be a dreadful thing? It's a good question.
We didn't hear the question.
The question, so this table said they had more questions than answers.
You can't hear them.
So the question was, why would giving someone a bill of divorce cause them to commit adultery? What's the relationship between the two things? What else did y'all come up with? We'll come back to that. Is this a nonviolent passage?
No.
No? Okay. In what way would forbidding divorce be nonviolent?
Well, if you couldn't get a divorce, you would be forced to resolve whatever conflicts were inherent in the union. Which...
Or not.
Or not. Right. It's the or not.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you could either try and improve the situation by changing behaviors, or you could continue to wallow in misery for decades.
Yes. And again, note who is the audience here? It's men, right? And especially in a society in which men hold most of the power. And actually, it's a whole lot more complicated than it's often given. A.J. Levine is a really good source here for how Christians have often used this verse to talk bad about Jewish divorce, and it's not at all clear that that is the case. The way we commonly read it, this sort of women have no power, and it was probably more complicated than that. And especially under Roman law, women had more power than we often think. Nevertheless, if read against anything like a patriarchal society where men tend to own property, and if women are dismissed from the household, they immediately need to find a new way to survive. And I think that's the common reading of this passage, that if I hand my wife a bill of divorce, for whatever reason, but maybe for any reason, I've put her in a situation where she may not have much to survive on, and so what does she have to do? She has to find someone else or something else. If her father's still alive, maybe she can return to the home. If not, she's got to find someone else who will take care of her. So it's removing options. It's removing freedom. This is not an amicable situation. And Jesus doesn't say, don't leave, right? He doesn't say to women especially, don't leave your husband. In fact, we know that people left their spouses to follow him. We have evidence of that. So this is about, or one way of looking at it is that it is about men treating women as though they could be disposed of. Men treating women as though they could be disposed of. And, I think you two had it right. It's saying there's no exit for you, guy, which isn't always good news, right? That's not sort of a pure recipe for, and now you've got to work it out. We all know couples who happily don't work it out, unhappily, their entire lives. So I think we have to be very careful with passages like this when we think about things like domestic abuse. Nevertheless, if there is a nonviolence to this, it is in sort of recognizing and owning whatever power society hands to us and not using that in this case, against women. And so this is the way that Father John Deere also interprets it. He sees it as sort of, it is for men to treat women as equals. And for Father John, this remains an important commandment because we still live in a society where that's not happening. We are not post-patriarchy. He thinks that. I definitely think that. And so until we arrive at that kind of situation, only then could we say, and also women, do this. But because this is still a situation where power often tends to be imbalanced, Jesus seems to be trying to redress that power imbalance. Yeah, Daryl.
The last sentence, or last part of the sentence, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, that makes me feel, am I right in thinking that historically that would be like almost like a business relationship or a business exchange between two men, where one man might divorce his wife so that another man could marry her does that make sense? Because that's what, the fact that it's tying into somebody else coming in and marrying this woman makes me feel like it's not just about the two people, it's about anybody else who, like if I, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know in its context whether that would be the conversation, whether a man would talk to another man about this. My sense is the context is the woman is dismissed and is kind of left to fend for herself. This is a really complicated passage, and biblical scholars still don't agree on exactly what Jesus is trying to get at here. Even something like adultery has a lot of different valences and understandings, as we see in our society. To be adulterous, it could refer to breaking a certain law, but it could also refer to a kind of attitude of the heart and everything in between. In general, it refers to like breaking your vows, which is not good, but it can also have a kind of moral or legal or purity standing in a culture. So that's complicated. And then the little Matthean clause here, unless the marriage is unlawful. The word is porneia, and that is a word that people still disagree on what it means. Father John thinks it means in cases of incest where you're marrying close relatives. Most biblical scholars would not agree. So it's incredibly complicated, which is why it's so clear in the Catholic Church. But I think there is something, one meaning that we can make of this, and fortunately we're free from having to make passages just mean one thing because they speak to us. One thing that this means, or could mean, is that men who are followers of Jesus, if they live in a society that does not treat women as equals, that part of nonviolence means doing that, both at individual levels and also at a system level approach. Yeah, thanks.
Weren't women stoned for adultery in those days?
That's the story. How often that actually happened is contested. But certain readings of the Hebrew Bible could support the possibility of capital punishment for a woman who's found in adultery. We definitely see that in the Gospel of John. How often that happened in actual society, again, scholars really go back and forth on this. It's hard to imagine a society where this happens often enough, but it makes for a great story. Yeah, Jason.
The phrase saying causes her to commit adultery, would that also just basically say that the man is also committing adultery by making someone else? You know what I mean? Does that tie him as equally guilt of adultery, or? I
think you could possibly get there, and I'm getting way out of my depth here. One of the possibilities, or one of the problems with that reading is, polygamy was sort of allowed in more ancient times, and read against the backdrop of that, that would be a case in which a man could have several wives, and that would not make him an adulterer. Again, this is not equal. So here I think we're sort of stuck. Jesus doesn't really say what the man is, other than a jerk, in violation of what Jesus is saying. But the concern really does seem to be the woman, and whoever the woman goes on to marry, because that man is marrying someone who is already sort of married to this other person. And you do see the Catholic Church trying to sort of parse this in its understanding that when two people exchange promises, the church doesn't have the authority to tell them that they didn't do that. And we can get into what that means, but.
I feel like I keep trying to twist this into somehow finding a way for there to be justice. You know what I mean? Like some sort of justice between the two parties, that there's equality.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah.
sorry.
The other historical piece here is the possibility that Jesus himself expected his reign to come very quickly. Most of the New Testament, especially early on, it's very clear that followers of Jesus expected that his return was imminent, and so you have people like Paul saying, if you're married, don't split. If you're not married, don't get married, because Jesus is coming, and it's not worth sort of settling in. So read against that backdrop, and Mark has this verse. The earliest gospel has the same saying, only Mark does not have the unless passage. His Jesus says, no divorce. It's possible that Jesus is trying to get people to sort of have an eye towards the impending apocalypse, and to not shake things up too much here, but to stick with what they have. It's possible. Okay, final comment. Yeah, Doreen.
Well, is this title of your paragraph from John's book?
It is.
Men and True Women. Well, that says to me that I think we, as a society, are looking at it in a patriarchal way, because that's how our society still is. I mean, it's improved somewhat, but it's still basically not.
Yeah.
I think he's just trying to help women out to get out of that.
Yeah, and here I think we'll close, because I know we're at time, and we'll pick up next week with John Deere's words on this. If a husband was divorcing his wife, it was because she was to blame. Not anymore, says Jesus. Here, Jesus announces, every husband is equally to blame when it comes to divorce. This is nothing less than revolutionary. No man would say or believe such a thing in Jesus' time. Many men today are still so infected with sexism and patriarchy that they consider women to be less than equal. Jesus teaches here a new depth of nonviolence, that men and women are totally equal, and that men should treat women with total respect, nonviolence, and dignity, and that men should presume, in fact, that they are to blame because of the legacy of male violence, sexism, and patriarchy. By saying that men are equally to blame in matters of divorce, Jesus elevates women and tears down patriarchy. He points to the coming of a new culture of equality and respect. And it's coming any day now. All right, we're going to pick up next week with Let Your Yes Be Yes and Your No Be No. Thanks for your attention and your participation this morning, and we'll see how far we get next week.